Sally, and thank you to all of you for coming, and for the organizations for hosting us. We are very cognizant that we are the last thing, I believe, between you guys and a cocktail reception, so we will be mindful of your time. We plan on taking some questions, and so we'll try to we'll dialogue for a little bit, but for the most part, we're looking for you guys to come up with some ideas. So it might be helpful to start out just to talk a little bit, Jose, about your background and your experience, both in the private sector and the public sector, helping companies, governments get through turbulent times or manage unanticipated change.
Okay, I'll do that, but let's be brief. Otherwise, we'll see an escapade going out the door. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. The Council of the Americas for me is sort of my second home. I'm here a lot, and I always depend on the Council for a lot of the thought leadership that I've seen on the region. I'm Cuban by birth. I've been practicing law for about 30 years, mostly in emerging markets, places that I tell people were normally where you can't drink the water, or at least you couldn't drink the water a while back. And so I started my legal career in the 80s when Latin America was going through the lost decade. I was restructuring debt. 90s, did a lot of privatization. I saw the region revive, and that was a lot of fun, going to places like Ecuador and Peru, especially in Peru, which was going through the shining path at the time. And my family didn't want me to go because they were afraid of what would happen. And then 2 years later, the place was booming, and it was wonderful to see. In the decade after that, I spent it again restructuring debt, working out on a number of foreign investments. And then in 2008, I caught the political bug, and I decided I wanted to help the Obama campaign, and did a lot of work on the Latin American policy side. Wrote things on Cuba for Obama, wrote things on trade, and when Secretary Clinton got named, she asked me to join her as Assistant Secretary for Economics, Energy, and Business Worldwide, and that was a lot of fun because I ended up spending time in places that I had never been to. Maybe 50% of my time was spent in the Middle East, in places like Libya, Tunisia, and the like, as they were going through the Arab Spring. And you could see a lot of similarities in many ways between what was going on there and some of the things that you guys have been talking about today. A lot of the Arab Spring was created by the frustrations of young people who didn't have opportunities, and basically saw that unless you came from the right families, unless you had the right ties to government, you could not succeed. And they wanted to be entrepreneurs. They wanted to find ways to get ahead, and they didn't see it. And so you had, starting in Egypt and moving on to other places, you had a lot of turmoil in the region that continues today. But a lot of it was economic. And then Secretary Clinton asked me to go there and see what we could do as in the United States to put those people together with U.S. companies and U.S. entrepreneurs to see if we could deal with some of the frustrations that engendered the Arab Spring. We weren't terribly successful, but that I think that only goes to show you that revolutions are messy. And I remember there was a Chinese prime minister in the 1950s was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell. And so I think that the book is open, but I do think that working in Latin America does prepare you for working in other parts of the emerging world.
You've traveled the world and you've seen a lot in your time. Have you ever seen a year, or I doubt you have seen a year quite like 2016 in terms of geopolitical happenings that we just didn't see coming? Predictors got nearly everything wrong, whether that was in Italy, the UK, or certainly here in the US with the election. what are you seeing in your corporate clients as they try to adapt to this kind of new world order of risk? And what are you seeing that you like, and what are you seeing that you hope may change?
So I think 2016 was a difficult year, especially for those of us who were working on one party's campaign. But and it continues to be difficult. But let's not overblow it. I mean, you've had, those of you who were around in 2008, you went home one Friday, and you next day, Lehman Brothers was out the window. So we've had turmoil in the past. The 2008 crisis was not a lot of people saw that coming. No, not a lot of people saw the defaults in Argentina in 2001 that spread in other parts of South America. No one saw in the 1980s that Mexico would default, so on and so forth. So I think the first thing you need to do, I think, when you have a 2016, is realize that uncertainty is to be managed, and you're not going to be able to have a silver bullet. And at the end of the day, you've got to be humble. That's something we learned, for example, in the Arab Spring. You've got to be humble in that in this year you have frustrations in certain parts of Europe, and certain, obviously, in the United States. But there's also some bright clouds in the horizon. Latin America, I think, is one of them. I think Latin America, with the rise of the middle class, I think even which leads, when you have a middle class that demands consumer goods, that demands the end of corruption, that wants infrastructure, those are things that I think are going to make the region do better in coming years. And in some ways, the policy that you're seeing out of the White House, I think, no matter what happens, has alienated and will alienate a large part of the population in Latin America, and I think that will have a lasting effect no matter what happens in the White House. But I do think that ultimately will make places like Mexico, like the Mexican economy, a lot more solid. You cannot run an economy when you export 80% of your goods when they go to one country, when they go to the United States. That just wasn't healthy. And at some point, something was bound to happen. And I think if you look at Mexico, if you look at other places that are trying to figure out what's going to happen with Trump in the White House, to me, that's a cause for optimism. But I think you have to have a little bit of a longer-term view. So, 2016 was difficult. 2017 ain't going to be easy. You still have a number of elections in Europe that I think could create some more uncertainty in France, in Belgium, in Holland, and also in Latin America. You have a couple of elections. But I think, again, you've got to be able to manage them, and you've got to realize that there are some underlying trends that are going to continue that do not necessarily reflect what's going on a daily basis, and I think there are opportunities. So I think 2016 was tough, but I don't think it was unique.
So if part of your job, as I understand it, when you were in the State Department, was to help attract international business to the United States to make investments here. If you're talking to a company that's a Spanish company, and they're thinking of making an investment in the United States, what are the concerns that they're flagging to you, and how are you reassuring them?
So I'm actually on the board of a Spanish company. Maybe that's why you asked, but which is called Iberdrola. It's a large utility. And I'm very proud of the fact that we are either the first or the second largest renewable energy provider in the world. I think Iberdrola is bullish in the U.S. It's done very well here. No matter what you say, the U.S. regulatory climate is strong. But I'm not now. I just in general, what I tell clients is, In the short term, I think if you look at the stimulus package, at the infrastructure plans that Trump has put forth, those should be additive to the economy. And I think what you have to worry about is what's going to happen in the midterm in terms of additional debt, inflation in the U.S. What's going to happen if the dollar continues to goes up? What's going to happen to our exports? I think, again, you look at the long-term trend, and then the U.S. continues to be a good place to invest. And a lot of that is because of the legal regime, the legal assurances that you get here, the fact that you've got a huge consumer class. 70% of our GDP comes from consumers. And I think that's going to continue. I think that the harder question, and I hope we get to it a little bit, is what do U.S. companies do if they want to go abroad, and how do they navigate between tweets by the administration and what might be some blowback in the local countries, in the foreign countries. But I think in the U.S., I think at least in the near term, I think things look good, and you're seeing it reflected in the stock market.
So let's drill down a little bit on that point about foreign companies or U.S. companies considering sending jobs elsewhere or investing elsewhere. This is obviously a president with a quick Twitter finger, and every communications firm is putting out thought leadership on here's how to frame your investment to not bring on the ire of Donald Trump. That being said, practically, do you think that's having a chilling effect on U.S. companies, either business decisions or direct investment elsewhere in the world?
I think it has. I mean, they're certainly worried about it, and in fact, yesterday I had a conversation with a company that wants to make a large investment in Mexico, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were afraid of what would be the reaction in the U.S. It happens to be a company that's not facing a binary question as to whether to invest or not in Latin America. It's going to make major investments in the U.S. But I think this administration has gotten itself in a very difficult position. You've got, especially with respect to Latin America, you've got an administration that basically it's an America first, which in some cases may be America only type of policy. It's got to feed its base. It does not have much in the way of, as the Democratic Party did, a desire not just to do well by business, but also to do well by a Hispanic constituency in the U.S. The Republican Party does not have much of a base in the Latino community, and that's what on the one hand you've got that position on the part of the administration. On the other hand, you've got in a place like Mexico, you've got a Peña Nieto with less than 20% or with 20% approval or rating. It's the one time he went up in his approval is when he decided not to come to the U.S. So he's in a very difficult position. And someone like AMLO, Lopez Obrador, is nipping at his heels. And so you've got both sides that are in very difficult positions. What I tell U.S. companies when they ask is, certainly with respect to Mexico, and I think also you could say that with respect to Colombia and Central America, now is the time when you can make some great friends by making statements about your long-term policy and the attractiveness of a country. I think you've seen companies that have said, we are investing in the U.S., but we're also investing in Mexico because we believe in the future of Mexico, and I think that's appreciated. And so the ability to reach out and to support those governments that are doing well, that are doing the right thing, is important now. That will be appreciated, and it'll have a long-term effect. And also, spending some time on community relations, sort of the soft power stuff, not the stuff necessarily that you're going to get out in an accounting class, but what they call in diplomacy soft power. spending time with the community, spending time with human resources, making sure that you're seen as not just someone who's going to come in, get your money out, and move on, but someone who believes in the future of that country and of that community, and that will pay off. And I think those companies that are the Walmarts of the world are doing that. They are investing in the U.S., but they're also investing in Mexico, and they say that's because we believe in the future of Mexico.
You said you've been practicing law for 30 years. By my count, that spans really the entire time that the internet has been something that people knew anything about. We're now in this commercial and personal culture where data and information and privacy is just hugely important. And I think if the election really taught us anything, it's that these leaks and the exposure of your own personal information and your own personal correspondence into the world is not necessarily something that you can avoid, even if you really try rather hard. What are companies doing to get ready for this, if anything? And what do you think the impact is in the way people do business, particularly across borders?
Yeah. Look, I remember being in Uruguay 15 years ago, and someone told me in Uruguay, confidentiality means you tell one person at a time. And so you've always had that concern. I think that what I see companies doing is number one, they are trying to minimize the leakage, and that there are things that you can do. They're also very concerned that they're taking it very seriously, the cybersecurity threat. Depending on what you are, if you're an infrastructure company, if you're a consumer company, you are a target for hackers. So they want the consumer information, or worse, they want to shut you down. And I see companies spending a lot of time and a lot of money training their employees, and then realizing that at some point something will leak and you'll have to deal with it. But the ones that I have seen, the ones that I know, are actually doing things like sending fake messages to their employees to see if they click. And if they click, they get a program, and they get told that they need to spend a weekend in training on how to avoid being hacked. And so they're doing what they can, realizing that it's not going to be foolproof, but that you can do things to minimize it. And I think that's, to me, those are best practices.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that where in the world do you see that risk, that cyber risk, as being greatest? I mean, I think we have this conventional understanding in the U.S. that it's driven out of Russia or the CIS countries. But do you see companies in particular parts of the world responding to this in different ways? Are there places that feel more or less secure to you?
I think it depends on the industry. I mean, for example, in the utilities world, in the infrastructure world, under Obama, they were forced to put together some plans. So I think the utilities, the infrastructure world, is much more advanced than perhaps the consumer world. I'm actually concerned when I talk to some consumer companies how little they have done, especially outside of the U.S., to guard their data. And in Latin America, I think we haven't seen huge hacks, but those are coming. And I think, to me, that's one of the concerns that I would have, and I would start dealing with it now.
Mm-hmm. Do folks have questions for Jose? Okay, let's see. All right. They're all anonymous questions. Interesting. Let's start with, let's go with the hardest one first. This is like Meet the Press calling you. In 2014, you wrote, Jose, that politically the stars were more aligned than ever in recent history between the U.S. and Latin America. What went wrong during the past few years?
Who asked that question? That's a great question, and I don't think I was wrong. I think if you look at our relations with Latin America in the last until the end of 2016, they were good and they were getting better. I mean, there's always this fear that the U.S. has been ignoring Latin America, and yet there are some people who say that the best thing that the U.S. can do is ignore Latin America. That the less the U.S. does with Latin America, the better they do. If you look at what was happening, I remember, for example, being in Cartagena for the Summit of the Americas. That was a disaster. And it was a disaster because everybody wanted to talk about two things. They wanted to talk about Cuba, and they wanted to talk about just the anti-U.S. feeling that was engendered by some of the economic policies. 2 years later, Cuba was off the table at the Summit of the Americas, and the economies, the trade with Latin America was booming. Yes, I mean, we are, China is doing quite well, but if you look at U.S. trade, it actually grew exponentially in the last 10 years. So I would argue that in fact relations were good. Look at our relations with Mexico, with a president from the PRI, which had always made a living being an anti-American president. These people wanted closer ties with the U.S. How hard is that to think about? Think about that 20 years ago, having a PRI president come to the U.S. and say, I want to create a common market with the U.S. To me, that was unheard of. And so I would argue, and this is, to me, that's not to get too political, that's a tragedy. That by the end of 2016, our relations with Latin America were quite good. We had succeeded in by being, in some ways, letting others take the lead. For example, in isolating Venezuela. Who talks about Chavez now in terms of a leader in the Americas? Who thinks of Cristina Kirchner as someone who did some good in Argentina? And the U.S. didn't do much. They let others take the lead. They refused to give their opponents a bully pulpit. They refused to give others, in their opponents in Latin America, the ability to use the U.S. as the boogeyman. I'm afraid that you keep calling people criminals and rapists, and you keep talking about a wall that's going to be paid for by taking 2% from remittances that are sent from here to the poorest Mexicans. That hurts, and maybe that won't go forward, but just the words have consequences. And my fear is that though that era of goodwill, of good feelings that was being created in Latin America is going to be very difficult to revive. So I don't think I was wrong. The stars were aligned, but the planets kept moving.
I'm going to ask one that I'm interested in the answer to, which is, how do you compare populism in the U.S. and in Latin America?
Populism, a political scientist will tell you, and I'm not a political scientist, is basically appealing to the other, or appeals against the other. Somebody else is the other. Somebody else is the bad guy. You saw it in places like Venezuela. Populism was Chavez railing against the corrupt upper class. In a place like Bolivia, you saw Morales suggesting that the indigenous community, and he had a point, that the indigenous communities have been oppressed by the white elites. In the U.S., there's a great study that I think explains a lot of what went on here in 2016. A Nobel Prize-winning economist from Princeton, Angus Deaton, talked about how in the U.S. the white males, their mortality rate was actually coming down, was being reduced, whereas in every other part of the world, white males' longevity was increasing. And in fact, in the last couple of years, the rate of suicides among white males was about the same as the rate of lung cancer as a cause of death. So think of that sort of the feeling that something had passed you by, that somebody else was benefiting at your expense, that you had 1% of the 1% controlling 50, 60, 70% of the wealth. Those are common. I think what you do with that is important, and that's for another day. But I think populism is about you and the other. You're polarizing a society.
Okay, this was a fun one. What is the most extreme crisis you've ever had to deal with, and what lessons did you learn from managing it?
Well, as a lawyer, I got a call one day in 2002 because I had a client that owned a bank, and they had $200 million stolen from that bank, and the bank was about to go bankrupt. This was in Uruguay. And basically they needed $200 million in the next 2 days, or else they were going under. This was Banco Comercial in Montevideo. We had to deal with that. We had to talk to the government, and the government would say, well, of course you're going to put in your $200 million. And they would say, not so fast. And that was something that took us 72 hours to try and figure out. And of course, a common problem in any crisis is you have incomplete information. So that to me was a crisis in the private sector. In the public sector, Haiti was a human tragedy. And how did you deal with that when you couldn't get planes in, when you had no phones, when you had a very little in the way of political support? Haiti didn't mean much to a lot of people in U.S. politics. And again, there we didn't have a lot of information. But I think of the Uruguay example. I think of some of the restructurings that we had to do in 10, 15 years ago as being crises that you sort of jump in and you figure it out as you go along.
Mm-hmm. I think as someone who manages crises that's most of my job, that information vacuum is the worst possible thing in a crisis, and not having a complete fact set at the beginning, or not being able to apprehend them through the process of dealing with your client or whoever you're talking to, just makes it incredibly hard. It's very difficult.
And I think also being able to get views from everyone in the group is important, because you may not have all the information, and you're all stressed, and you're trying to get as much information as you can. I remember, for example, during this Uruguayan crisis, we drafted a beautiful contract, a gorgeous contract, and one of my clients said, a banker, he said, great contract, but it won't mean a thing. It won't solve our problem. And I said, how could it not? It's beautiful. You can take him to court. And they said, it's just not going to happen. It's just there are political aspects to this that you're overlooking. And so being able to get, not just in my case the legal side, but also the political side, the economic side, being able to get everybody's views in a crisis situation will always be helpful.
We just realized that the impact of Donald Trump's election is that we all now talk like him, because Jose is talking about it was a beautiful contract. It was so beautiful. It's like we've all fallen into the under the spell of Donald Trump.
Don't say that to me.
So with that, I think we'll close, and thank you all for having us here today.
Okay, guys, to close out the conference, it is my honor to introduce the America Society and Council of the Americas CEO, Susan Segal. Susan came to the ASCOA from a career in banking, and as Linda Rottenberg was kind of alluding to today, she really pioneered early-stage venture capital investing in Latin America. and she is regularly referred to today as one of the most important and influential businesswomen in the region. She's also my mentor and, most importantly, my boss. So with that, I'll pass it over to Susan to close us out. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, wow, look at all these people that are still here. Congratulations and thank you. Thank you, Allie. For me, having Allie work for me from the time she got out of college until this summer when she will also go to business school, you think there's a pattern here, has been a real honor and a pleasure, and I don't know quite know what I'm going to do without her. So she's in charge of finding her replacement. Otherwise, I take back her recommendation to business school, and that will be that. So I want to start by thanking, obviously, Allie and Rebecca and our entire YPA team, and the team from Columbia Business School, my alma mater, and the team from NYU Stern Business School. Thank you so much for putting this together. It was just amazing. Now I'm going to sound like Donald Trump, but I don't want to do that either. It was just amazing to see Columbia Business School, NYU Stern, and YPA work together. That's how it should work, and frankly, it's just great. And the results were over 200 people being here today. Some people rotated in and out, and some just really outstanding panels. I didn't get to spend the entire day here, because I'm going to be traveling for the better part of the next 2 weeks, and so I did have to do a little bit of work. With that, I wanted to Allie asked me to just make a couple of comments, and I'm going to do that. A little bit about what I've been saying to Latin American governments as we go into this very uncertain time. Latin America, I've been working with Latin America now for, well, I'll give my age away, but let's call it the better part of more than 35 years, even though it's a lot more than 35 years. And I think Latin America in many ways, after starting with the Latin American debt crisis of the 80s, which probably a lot of you read about, studied, and I actually participated in, I think Latin America's kind of looked north, and in some ways has relied a little bit on the United States to help them solve their problems. So I like to always think in the positive. And I think actually this moment is an enormous opportunity for Latin America. It's an enormous opportunity for Latin America because I believe that this is the opportunity for Latin America and Latin American countries to control what they can control. And what does that mean? That means that this is an opportunity for Latin American countries to finish their structural reforms, their micro reforms, and to begin to integrate within Latin America. In the European Union, commerce among the European Union represents about 60% of all trade. We talk a lot about the Pacific Alliance, which, as you know, is Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. But did you know that commerce among those countries is probably started a few years ago at 3% and probably now isn't more than about 5 to 7%? Do you know that for the infrastructure between Argentina and Chile, a path to Pacific, right, is really just a path, like a 2-lane highway through the Andes, and if it snows, there's no commerce that gets to the Chilean coast. Brazil isn't really linked to the Pacific. We've talked a lot about that over the years. Railroads are almost non-existent, and believe it or not, while airline and routes have improved, there's still a lot of different countries that you need to go back to Miami to get from one country to another. So when I think about all of this, I think that this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for Latin America to integrate more among themselves. And now, in most countries in Latin America, you have countries that are willing and able to do that. Presidents that generally think alike and see the opportunity to integrate, build more commerce, build more infrastructure. And so as I think about this moment in time, where yes, potentially the United States is going to look more inward within our own borders, I think it's also a moment for Latin America to seize that as an opportunity and control the variables they can control, because the United States will wake up again and say, I've got to be part of this amazing hemisphere, because the fact of the matter is, if you take the innovation which is happening in the United States, and you combine that with the demographics of the population in Latin America, we are, without a doubt, the most competitive hemisphere in the world. I would have said that about North America, too. But so that's kind of how I see it. So if you work for the next few years, you try to build this, by the time the United States realizes what they're missing, if we decide to look more inward than outward, maybe Latin America will be speaking with fewer voices, which will make hemispheric integration much easier. So that's kind of my view a little bit on the hemisphere. I also think that one should also note, and I'm sure you've talked about this in panels today, that we have to look, and I believe this strongly in the United States, not just at the current account, we've also got to look at the capital account. Because there's a lot of two-way investment going on. There's a lot of Latin American companies that are beginning to invest in the United States. Companies like Bimbo in Mexico own some of the neatest and best brands. Thomas's English Muffin, owned by Bimbo. Sara Lee, owned by Bimbo. Brazilian 3G owns Heinz, owns Burger King, own enormous brands. And every day, Tequin is about to open a big pipe plant, I guess, in Texas. They own the Mexican side, and now they're going to own the US side. So there's lots of investment in the United States as well, and I think that will continue. So I think that this is a time for reflection, but a time for opportunity, and we have to think in a positive sense. And finally, I only want to echo what Linda said today, because I think one of the things that has changed Latin America is entrepreneurship. I think there's nothing that has been more empowering to young Latin Americans than believing that they can go out and change the world. And that has come on the political side, in that many countries in Latin America that did go through periods of dictatorships, now people in the private sector and the public sector, the leaders are no longer of that generation. But on the private side and the business side, there is an enormous explosion of entrepreneurship. And in Argentina, that's already into the second generation, because you have people that have turned out to be great entrepreneurs that have now gone into government. People like Andy Frary, who runs a big part of the city of Buenos Aires under el jefe de gobierno, Larreta. So I think that this is also, entrepreneurship is another really empowering, enormous opportunity. And I will make one last comment, and then I will shut up and let you go to drink wine and eat cheese or whatever else they're doing, because there's one area where I think we need to focus a lot more, and Allie knows where I'm headed, and that's women. There are still not enough women. It is embarrassing that I still go to meetings where there are only a handful of women, where you can sit in a room. I was in a room actually at one of our events. There were 50 CEOs, and I could count the number of women, which included myself and 2 of my team on one hand. That is just unacceptable, and that's something else that has to change. It's not just women, it's diversity, because when you have diversity, you have multiple points of view, and that drives better economic management, better economic decisions. So, all of you young women, this is the responsibility not just of women, this is also the responsibility of men. And we need to get more women in the workplace. We need to empower more women to take leadership, to stay in the workplace, because we need more women. If we're going to really make a difference and change and be an agents for change, we need more women in climbing the ladder in corporations. We need more women in Congress, and hopefully, eventually, we need more women presidents. So with that, I empower you all. Thank you all for being here at the Americas Society. Thank you, all of you who put this together, and enjoy the evening and this wonderful spring day in New York, and let us all hope that it lasts. Thank you.